The Mongol Empire didn't collapse because it lost its wars. It collapsed while it was still winning. So what really destroyed the largest empire in history? You might assume the answer involves massive civil wars, impossibly long borders to defend, or maybe some sudden, overwhelming foreign invasion. And sure, those explanations are common, but they actually begin the story far too late. The real truth, which is hidden right there in the historical data and the institutional changes of the time, is honestly a lot more unsettling. By the time the empire officially fractured into competing states, the actual collapse had already been unfolding for decades. Because the Mongols didn't lose. They won so hard that they quite literally broke their own system. I mean, they conquered more territory in less time than any empire before them, creating a superpower that looked absolutely unstoppable to the rest of the world. But, that was precisely the problem. Success creates a completely different kind of danger. It triggers this cascading failure, something we still see in complex modern organizations today, actually, which quietly makes leaders totally blind to the problems forming right beneath their unprecedented prosperity. They were absolute masters of the saddle, but complete novices of the state. Section 1. The Administration Trap. A civilization that was built purely for rapid expansion suddenly found itself having to manage unprecedented success, almost overnight. Within just a few decades, rulers of the open steppe were governing incredibly prosperous Chinese cities and Persian capitals. And the core systemic problem became incredibly obvious very quickly. The skills required to conquer the world are the exact opposite of the skills required to govern it. Think about it. Winning territory requires speed and boldness, but keeping it, that requires patience, careful compromises, and, taxation. The very qualities that carried the Mongol armies across Eurasia offered absolutely zero answers to the insanely complex challenges of daily administration. So to survive as administrators, different branches of the imperial family just started adapting to the specific societies they controlled. They embraced Chinese institutions to form the Yuan dynasty over in the east. They relied heavily on Islamic administration for the Ilkhanate and Persia, and some held on to the old steppe traditions in the Golden Horde. And at first glance, this looked like a total stroke of genius, an incredibly flexible, adaptable empire. But while it brilliantly solved their immediate local problems, it quietly planted the seeds for our next massive systemic failure. Section 2. The Loss of Mongol Identity. By solving that immediate problem of local governance through adaptation, the empire accidentally engineered a fatal identity crisis. Turns out, flexibility definitely has its limits. So first we have this vast, rapid expansion. Then, second, we see cultural assimilation happening just to manage that expansion. The rulers of China gradually began thinking and acting basically exactly like Chinese emperors, while the rulers of Persia increasingly governed as Persian monarchs. Which leads us right to step 3, a fractured identity. Every regional government became super efficient inside its own territory, but they were slowly, almost unnoticeably, erasing their shared Mongol purpose. The descendants of Genghis Khan, they still shared the exact same bloodline, they still waved the same banners, but they were no longer building the same future. And the thing is, when a system's leaders stop sharing a unified vision, loyalty fragments. It's just human nature, and this fragmented loyalty pulled the entire empire into a really dangerous new era, an era where diversity slowly and inevitably just became division. Section 3. When wealth replaced discipline. Once the empire fractured to govern more efficiently, this brand new ruling class emerged, and they completely traded that harsh, unifying steppe discipline for just unimaginable wealth. Survival wasn't their greatest challenge anymore. Success was. Just consider the massive shift in their lifestyle, going from felt tents on the plains to these massive imperial palaces. They swapped military strategy on the open steppe for insulated, highly paranoid court politics. And to support these competing branches of the imperial family and their massive new bureaucracies, the system just started squeezing local populations with heavy taxes, which fundamentally altered the core incentives of power. The harsh, unforgiving reality of the steppe, the reality that once heavily rewarded raw competence and strict meritocracy, was completely replaced. A totally new elite class emerged, and they were entirely focused on protecting their privileges rather than actually producing results. Power became connected to possession instead of performance. The government just became obsessed with preserving its own wealth instead of nurturing the conditions that actually created that wealth in the first place. And that set the perfect stage for massive structural fragility. Section 4. The cost of interconnectedness. Now, this loss of internal discipline was dangerously compounded by the very thing that made the Mongols so incredibly powerful to begin with, their vast, highly interconnected network. They built this hyper-efficient supply chain of relay stations, the famous YAM system, creating what was essentially the world's first truly interconnected superpower. But this introduces a really scary concept, cascading failure. When absolutely every region depends on the uninterrupted flow of supplies, information, and revenue, a disruption anywhere means a crisis literally everywhere. This network was the ultimate double-edged sword. Initially, sure, these connections created enormous strength. They rapidly accelerated trade, brilliant new ideas, and groundbreaking technology. But eventually, they created massive vulnerability. The very same roads that accelerated communication also perfectly accelerated political unrest. When climate shifts caused severe droughts, the military starved right along with everyone else. And honestly, worst of all, trade caravans completely unknowingly carried the Black Death from one end of Eurasia all the way to the other. And this, right here, is one of history's deepest, most tragic ironies. The Mongols were not defeated because their system stopped working. No, they suffered because their highly complex system continued working exactly as it had been designed. The relay stations remained highly efficient. The roads remained wide open. Only now, instead of spreading wealth and prosperity, they were spreading collapse and disease at record speed. The empire had simply become too interconnected to save itself from its own cascading crises. Section 5. When leadership stops learning. Faced with this newly fragile network and all these cascading crises hitting at once, the Mongol leadership suffered the ultimate institutional failure. They just stopped trying to fix the system. Look, the difference between civilizations that endure and those that disappear entirely is whether they can actively correct their failures before they become irreversible. And the Mongols totally lost this ability. Their incentive structures completely inverted. Practical, systemic problem-solving was thrown out the window, replaced with sheer, desperate political self-preservation. Leaders stopped asking what is best for the empire and instead only asked, what is best for my throne? Because of this massive shift in priorities, critical problems were just left to rot. Much-needed tax reforms were constantly delayed, which bred deep, simmering local resentment. Trade routes became totally insecure and responsibility was just endlessly shifted onto someone else's plate. Blatant abuses by provincial officials were systematically ignored, mainly because solving deep structural issues offered way fewer political rewards than simply preserving their existing power. The empire literally just lost the capacity to confront its own uncomfortable realities. Section 6. The Empire that Warned the Future. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway of this explainer. The decline of the Mongol Empire wasn't some sudden dramatic military defeat straight out of a movie. It was a slow, quiet, administrative rot, and it serves as an unbelievably powerful warning from the past that perfectly mirrors the vulnerabilities of successful modern institutions today. No empire becomes too large to fail. It only becomes large enough to believe it cannot. The Mongols proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that endless expansion and unprecedented wealth are absolutely no substitute for institutions that actually possess the discipline to learn, adapt, and correct their own mistakes. Complacency, it turns out, is far harder to recover from than poverty. So as we look at the incredibly complex, interconnected systems that you and I rely on today, we really have to ask ourselves, how are we measuring our own strength? Are we just blindly trusting in yesterday's success and the sheer size of our resources? Or do we actually have the courage and the discipline to confront our own flaws before they become totally irreversible? It's a question every great system is going to have to answer eventually. Thanks for exploring this fascinating historical explainer with me, and I highly encourage you to look around and think about where else you might see these exact same patterns playing out right now.